Hi, mystery writers. Welcome to Mystery Fix, where we talk about writing a great mystery. And today I want to demystify the 4X structure, especially for mystery writers, because mystery writers have some special concerns. We talk about this a lot on Mystery Fix. So, what the 4X structure does is enabling you to build your story around main events. So between a scene by scene, chapter by chapter outline and writing with no structure, you have a middle ground. And when you understand the 4-act structure, you give yourself the freedom to create your story around those main events. And it's easy for beginning writers to get lost in 3 acts, beginning, middle, and end, and the 4-act structure and the main events in each act give you a framework like tent poles. And you're able to drape the fabric of your story around those tent poles. So when you know the structure, it's easy to keep the main events in your head as you write, because you have little mini goals that you're reaching as you create your story, and each event is a destination, and at each event the story changes. um, Change builds tension, and tension keeps readers turning the pages. So we want to build that into our stories as much as possible. So you have the detective and the murder and possibly the villain, and now it's time to create your story. So, Act One, let's start with that. And that's you set up your story and you immediately start complicating things. So, the beginning is about bringing your reader into the story. In a mystery, you introduce them to your sleuth and oftentimes the murder. Sometimes the murder happens later on, but usually it's the case that the murder happens in Act One. One of the best ways to introduce your sleuth is to show him solving a problem. Demonstrate those skills that your sleuth has in order to find the murderer, or illustrate at least one of their strengths that you've created in your character background. And if you know how he will catch the villain, mirror that talent at the beginning of your story. So introduce your reader to the sleuth and their everyday world by showing how he acts when faced with a problem. I think that's one of the best ways to start your mystery. The initial problem isn't the murder itself, but it's a problem that shows how your sleuth interacts and solves problems, because you're going to be throwing a lot of problems your sleuth's way. So highlight those skills at the beginning. And once your reader knows your sleuth and sees them in action, something happens that triggers the story. And that's called the inciting incident. And once your reader has a taste of your sleuth, bring them into the main problem of the story. Move your sleuth out of their everyday world into a new challenge. In this scene, present your sleuth with a challenge he didn't see coming. It's a surprise. It's a surprise to your sleuth, and it's a surprise to your readers. Something happens that pulls your sleuth toward the main mystery. So it's often not the murder itself, but it's something tangential to that main story. And it could be a new neighbor or an old lover or a vehicle breakdown or anything you want to imagine. And although your sleuth and your reader doesn't know it yet, this small disturbance in the sleuth's regular life is heading toward the big mystery. So it's a real setup. Once you introduce this event and show your sleuth's reactions to that event, it's time to meet the mystery head on. So in the first act, you end with the first plot point. So now you introduce the dramatic event that must be answered in the climax of your story. So now you've got the setup for your reader to get to the end, the reveal, showing who the killer is. In a mystery, your sleuth is brought on or volunteers, depending on the type of mystery you're writing. At this point, your sleuth is brought in to find the killer. How this event unfolds will depend on the type of mystery you write. A cozy heroine may take on the search, or a cop may be up next on the rota. It just all depends on your story. Either way, your sleuth protagonist enters the mystery and takes on the challenge of solving the puzzle. And now you're ready for Act 2 in the 4-act structure. And Act 2 is conflict, rising action, in discovery. Act 2 is all about poking around and probing to learn about the victim and the murder. Before this time, your sleuth knew nothing about the victim, or very little, and now he must examine the physical evidence and discover possible suspects. So in this section of your mystery, your sleuth gets to know the victim's world, what the victim did, who was in the victim's world, why the victim was where they were when they were murdered, as much about the victim as possible. And this is the place where you introduce any subplots. If you're going to have a love interest or the sidekick has a problem, this is the place in Act 2 where you start those subplots rolling along. So with those, you get more complications. Okay, right in the middle of Act 2, you have what is called a pinch point. Things just don't go smoothly. And a piece of evidence is lost, or your sleuth misinterprets, for now at least, the significance, or he meets suspects and they have their own personal reasons for resisting and not fully cooperating. So he only gets a partial picture of that victim's world. And so at the pinch point, you want to challenge your sleuth, and whatever your sleuth thinks is right, that approach is not working. It's the big, like, stop point. So remember I said, at these major points, on these tent poles, you want to have a change, and this is one of them, those pinch points where the sleuth says, okay, I'm going to go find the suspects, I've got all the evidence here, but then something happens, and it's not as easy as it first seems. Your sleuth is nowhere near discovering who the killer is. And during this discovery phase in Act 2, you throw in as many complications as you can and make each complication more challenging than the last. Because as you build your story, you're going to be creating rising tension. More complications mean more tension, and more tension keeps readers guessing and turning the pages. At the end of Act 2, you have the midpoint of the story, and you're going to be halfway through your story. This is a crucial turning point in your story. I know I've mentioned before watching television mysteries, because you can do that really quickly. And by golly, if you stop streaming right at that moment where you think it's the midpoint and you look and you see the beginning time and the end time, yep, you're right there in the middle. So at this point in the middle of your story, the story pivots. It's going to go in a whole new direction. Everything that happened in Act 1 and Act 2 is not working. All right? So your sleuth may discover that she's been going down the wrong path and has to rethink everything. Or he may be just so discouraged he thinks about giving up. Okay, this is that pivot point, and now we're going to go into Act 3, which is the crisis. And the crisis, after the midpoint, your sleuth looks for a new approach. Okay, everything they did before didn't work. It wasn't successful. So now your sleuth has to re-examine everything he learned in Act 2. So you're going to add lots of complications and twists to the subplots here as well. Remember, you're going to carry those along interspersed with your main story if you decide to do a subplot. Not every mystery has a subplot, so that's your choice. Anyway, about halfway through that third act, you have another pinch point, and this is one of those places where things get tough. And your sleuth finds that that new direction he chose after the midpoint will not get the results he wanted. And the undiscovered villain may set a trap that confuses your sleuth, or your sleuth realizes she's just in way over her head. This pinch point is another turning point, another change in the story. And oftentimes at this point, your sleuth has to gather new forces, find new allies, find support, discover new evidence, and somehow get closer to discovering the murderer. And your sleuth examines all the old evidence with new information and takes a fresh approach, because your sleuth is looking for the evidence or suspect statement he overlooked before. Now, on this new discovery path, your sleuth feels closer to the killer, but still doesn't know who it is. Okay? And then at the end of Act 3, you have a plot point, and this is one of those tent poles. The killer antagonist uses some kind of smokescreen, and everything the sleuth thought he knew goes nowhere. This is a really upsetting moment for your sleuth. And remember, you've been building rising action, so you can make this really tough for your sleuth. So your sleuth needs to clear his vision of the victim's world and take yet another new approach. All right? All right, at this plot point change, we go into Act 4, and this is the climax and the wrap up. Now you're heading toward the end of your mystery. From that plot point, your detective is captured or blocked from finding the killer, and the victim's world becomes more of a mystery. In other words, the more your sleuth thinks they know about that murder, everything just goes topsy-turvy. She's not seeing anything the right way, and if she's trapped or captured, there's no way out. And you often find at this point in mysteries that something dire happens. Your sleuth is actually physically trapped or captured, or there's some kind of physical something that keeps them from moving forward. But once they're in that trap, they see a way out, and after the escape from the trap or block, your sleuth starts rethinking and finally gets a glimpse of who the killer might be. But there's still something that isn't clear. There's still kind of a mist over really identifying the killer, and he gets ready to confront the killer, but there's one last defeat, and it's the biggest of all. Your detective knows the killer's dodging, but he can't get to that final confrontation, and for the moment, the killer survives any accusation. Your detective finally finds the killer, but the killer has a surprise for the detective. And your detective may have made a false assumption or misread the killer's intent, and the killer pulls out one last trump card, all the stops, and one the detective didn't expect. It's that thing your detective didn't see. And whether it's a battle of wits or hand-to-hand fighting, the killer plays one last card. In Act 4, you pull out all the stops. The confrontation and the reversals are the most challenging of your entire story, and the villain has the upper hand, except your detective finally realizes how to confront the villain and challenge that villain face to face. And at this point, your sleuth reveals the murder. And your sleuth also shines the spotlight on their special skills that led them to this final confrontation and revelation. You are illuminating all the skills of your sleuth and how they got to figuring it out and getting to that confrontation with the killer. In the midst of all this rising action in Act 4, you want to bring each subplot to a conclusion, because once your sleuth reveals the killer, you've finished your unwritten agreement with your reader to solve the puzzle. So before that final reveal, you want to make sure you're closing down your subplots one by one. And finally, we have the revelation and the wrap-up. And this is the end of your story. So once your sleuth has revealed the villain, wrap up your mystery. When the killer's revealed, bring your story to a quick conclusion. That's it. You've made this agreement with your readers to present them with a puzzle and solve the puzzle. And as far as the readers are concerned, once that killer is revealed, the puzzle is solved, and you've done your job to create a great mystery. Okay, so that's Acts 1, 2, 3, and 4. And a little bit more about that framework, because it is the framework for your story. The 4-act structure gives you the freedom to write without a commitment to each scene while keeping in mind the important steps of your story. So it's an easy way to keep your writing flowing without going, okay, I said I was going to do the scene this way, but now it feels like it should do this instead. You don't have to worry about a scene by scene by scene. You're just going from one major point in that 4-act structure to the next major point, and you have a lot of freedom in between to be the creative that you are and write your story. Some writers find it helpful to sketch out the major story points, the inciting incident, the first plot point, the pinch point, the midpoint, the second pinch point, and the climax. In other words, they sketch those out before they start writing. So they really have a solid idea of where they're going in between those major tent poles. And after they note these major story points, all the chapters in between flow toward the next story point. And as they write, they have a goal in mind to get to the next story point. Other writers just keep those major story points in their head and write. And it's up to you how you want to put together your story structure. But beginning writers find that having the major story points in mind keeps them from writing themselves into a corner or going off track. It saves a lot of time of overwriting or writing a whole chapter or two that go nowhere, and then you end up deleting. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I find the 4x structure very helpful. And please support these videos on Patreon. And I will see you next time.